Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture in the series, the Distinguished Lecture Series at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at ISRO Bhopal, Thinking with Empire, Botany and Environmental Humanities by Professor Banu Subramaniam. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Banu for this much awaited lecture. Banu's work is an inspiration to many of us in the field of science studies. Personally, I have been reading Banu's work for a long time, and I benefited much from engaging with her work, very significant work on science and religion and feminist science studies, particularly. And it gives me great happiness as well because I teach her work in my classes. Trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist, Banu's pioneering research in feminist science studies has made her a leading scholar in the field. Her work explores the philosophy, history, and culture of the natural sciences and medicine as they relate to questions of gender, race, ethnicity, and caste. Her latest research rethinks the field and practice of botany in relation to histories of colonialism and xenophobia, and explores the wide travels of scientific theories, ideas, and concepts as they relate to migration and invasive species. Banu is currently professor of Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's the author of two path-breaking books, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity in 2014, and Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, which is undoubtedly one of the most important books to understand, to make sense of science and religion in our times. She has also co-edited very important volumes. For example, Feminist Science Studies, A New Generation in 2001, which in many ways inaugurated a new way of thinking about science and feminism, Making Threats, Biofears, and Environmental Anxieties in 2005, and recently Meet, a Transnational Analysis. She's currently finalizing a new book titled Decolonizing Botany, from the herbarium to the planetarium. Of course, Banu has won many important awards, such as in 2020, Michelle Kendrick Memorial Book Prize from the Society for Literature, Science and the Arts for Holy Science. Ghost Stories for Darwin was winner of the Ludwig Fleck Prize 2016 for an outstanding book across the breadth of science and technology studies. Thank you very much for joining us today, Banu. The discussant for today, Vinitha Gowda, is an evolutionary biologist and botanist by training. Vinitha received a PhD from the George Washington University, Washington, DC, from the Department of Biological Sciences in the Columbian School of Arts and Sciences. Vinitha then went on to do her postdoctoral work in the Botany Department of the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, and later with National Parks, Singapore, Botany Gardens, before joining ISRO Bhopal, where she is currently an associate professor at the Department of Biological Sciences. Vinitha is very passionate about understanding evolution of plants and tropical biodiversity, and she is actively involved and interested in building a scientific community which is sensitive towards issues of equity, diversity, and inclusiveness in science. With that, I invite Banu to start the lecture. Once Banu's lecture is over, Vinitha will respond for 15 minutes and then we'll have a question and session. Thanks again for joining. Over to you, Banu.
Thanks, Rennie, for that glowing introduction. I don't know that I deserve it, but thank you. And I just want to say I'm equally inspired by your work and your recent book, which is, I think, such a great ethnography of science in India. And also thanks to Vinitha and Anandita for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, yes, we can see it.
How to tell the story of our planet. A story of a once conjoined land called Pangaea, drifting away into continents. Laurasia, Gondwana land, moving, breaking up, moving, into continents as we know it, still moving. In millions of years, it will rejoin into a new Pangaea. Species separated at birth will reconnect again hundreds of millions of years later. Will they still be the same species? Will they biologically recognize each other? Across these vast timescapes and mobile placescapes, who belongs where? Who are kith and kin in this new land? How do we tell a story of belonging, unbelonging, and rebelonging in this long arc of planetary time? But first, let us ask, what did colonizers do to the land and its inhabitants? Here, Leanne Simpson is very useful. As she argues, really what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is, how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And she answers, 1, you use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from the land. 2, you remove agency from the plant and animal worlds. And 3, you reposition the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Ours is fundamentally a story of violence. A teeming, inventive life on Earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien, colonizer and colonized. We have rendered a vital, vibrant planet into desolate landscapes of cracked and crushed earth, an ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery, colonialism, and empire. A feminist retelling of this story insists that there is no abstract Anthropocene, but a sexually, racially, and caste-driven stratified anthropos, where some anthropos colonized, conquered, enslaved, and dehumanized other anthropos. Then they returned home with their rich spoils to build fortresses and enact borders, boundaries, and laws to keep and protect their stolen fortunes. No pristine Eden here, no purity, no corner untouched by colonialism and its afterlives and the rapacious tentacles of modernity. Science has been integral to this, through conceptual landscapes of gender, race, caste, class, indigeneity, binaries of sex, gender, native, alien, cis, trans, heterosexual, homosexual, colonizer, colonized, upper caste, lower caste, able bodies, disabled bodies. Science has created biopolitical landscapes of inferior and superior bodies. Like the original colonists, modern science, in the name of rectifying the horrors of the past, has recolonized rather than decolonized. Through a politics of purity, fields such as conservation biology, restoration ecology, reproductive biology, seed and germplasm banks, these savior sciences preserve the legacies of empire. In short, we have transformed the majestic, deep history of planetary time, of plant time, into the reductionist linear time of a botanical world. It is this transformation of plant worlds into the field of botany that interests me here. Today, plant worlds are botany. As plant lovers, we use botanical knowledge every day. What do we do with this horrendous legacy? How do we reckon with our love of plants and botany and their deep entanglements in the history of colonialism, conquest, and slavery? If botany is a powerful site that has shored up a normative nature, mobilized as a potent site for the management and recuperation of white Western patriarchy, how do we decolonize botany and our love for plants? Here I want to offer some reflections, some seeds for a decolonial botany in 3 acts. Where are you from? Where is your family from? Who are your ancestors? We are obsessed with origin stories. Cataloging plants and people by their origin stories is a prelude to an originary story where all earthly creatures inhabit preordained stories, rife with ancestral claims and hierarchies of race, caste, sex, species, gender, sexuality, nation. Once an originary story, the future is sealed. Things begin as they end, hierarchies preserved. Planet Earth turns, but the stories remain in place. We practice originary sin everywhere in our plant worlds. Originary sin is possible because of our profound botanical amnesia that erases history. To understand and ground our understanding of originary sin, I use the field of invasion biology as a case study. A new subfield emerging in the 1980s. It has exploded since. By definition, invasive species must be foreign. We have seen a resurgence of xenophobic alarm from the political right and left, from environmentalists and non-environmentalists alike. A veritable well-funded industry of bioinvasion, an entire academic, policy-oriented, and activist field. The idea of invasion biology is predicated on a binary view of nature in place and nature out of place. Invasion biology stokes alarm of a world increasingly out of place. Cultural theorists argue that this recent hyperbole about alien species is best understood as a cultural panic about changing racial, economic, and gender norms in the nation. The perceived globalization of markets continues to be interpreted by elements of both the right and the left as a problem of immigration. Thus, immigrants and foreigners, products of the global, are perceived as one of the key reasons for problems in the local. Thinking of invasion biology through the histories of empire is enlightening because it reveals a profound botanical amnesia. Our theories of nature often do not consider the histories of empire in shaping the biogeography of non-human entities in the world. Yet empire is as central to non-human worlds as human worlds. Where humans went, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and viruses went along. Indeed, there are no natures and cultures, only nature cultures. What if we think empire through nature cultures and trace the shared histories of colonial migration? In this light, environmental historians argue that we should understand imperialism as fundamentally an ecological project in which humans, plants, and other species were shuffled around the earth in schemes for colonization and conservation. In the early modern period, botany was big science and big business, critical to Europe's ambitions as a colonial trader. Colonialism ushered a massive and grand reshuffling of global biota. It would be accurate to characterize colonial expansion as the original bioinvasion. We can and should understand the botanical sciences as a significant legacy in the afterlives of empire. Colonialism fueled an extractive economy through the objectification, commodification of the colonized world and the destruction of local knowledges. In its place, the colonial order installed the biological sciences as the universal, abstract, and expert knowledge. Local ecologies were transformed by colonial logics. Colonial roots of plants included the famous spiced roots, lumbar resources, plantation crops, horticultural specialties, but also a trove of other agricultural plants and animals. Horticultural societies and gardens across the West cultivated the exotic and the curious. Kew Gardens and other such sites became repositories of the world's biota. In most countries, agriculture in contemporary times includes predominantly foreign plants and animals. Thinking of contemporary invasion biology alongside colonial botany brings into stark focus the hubris of colonial logics. During colonial rule, there was a laissez-faire attitude to unlimited mobility across borders. For example, in the 19th and 20th century, the US Department of Agriculture had an active program where they sent biologists as explorers across the globe to find new and interesting plants of economic and aesthetic interest. For example, David Fairchild, who was director of the Seed and Plant Introduction section, is said to have introduced just himself more than 110,000 species and varieties into the United States. Similarly, the American Acclimatization Society introduced all the bird species mentioned in Shakespeare's works into New York's Central Parks in 1890s. Such an open and laissez-faire attitude of US policy was the norm until the early 19th century. As Alfred Crosby argues, the roots of European domination of the Western world lie in their creating new Europes wherever they went. Settler colonists ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went. They thrived while indigenous ecosystems collapsed. The mass export of resources out of the colonies led to growing ravages of the environment through unchecked industrialization and logics of development in newly independent post-colonial nations. In the context of the history of empire, the rise of the discourse of invasive species is particularly ironic. As colonialism ushered in new landscapes of empire and new formations of nature cultures, nativist thinking re-engaged with national borders. It is an ultimate act of irony that after centuries of global expansion, ecological decimation of the planet, those very colonial nations now insist on preserving the new Europes from newer immigrants from Asia, South America, and Africa. Tracking the histories of invasive rhetoric allows us to understand how plant, animal, and human laws, so quarantine laws of plant and animals and immigration laws of human, developed alongside with each other in creating national exclusion acts. Indeed, in the United States, the poignant case of settler colonialism rewrites the white settlers as the natives, as opposed to the Native Americans, creating all foreigners as undesirable. I re-narrate these abbreviated history to highlight both the hubris of empire and its subsequent amnesia that together prevent us from a true botanical reckoning with our colonial past. Invasion biology is entirely a project of colonial nostalgia and return. A botanical reckoning is a profound recognition that frameworks of nature in place and out of place are political constructions, attempting to fossilize particular ecological and evolutionary moments as the true native nature for posterity. Understanding the world as dynamic nature cultures reminds us that despite a cultural predilection for nostalgia, the biota of the world have their own agency and they propel their own evolutionary futures. Biological nostalgia is a fundamentally unecological project. We do not and cannot control the world, even if we wish to. A true biological reckoning would acknowledge that we are all migrants now, all refugees of a ravaged nature cultural past, seeking to salvage our nature cultural present and futures. We are all refugees now, albeit in very unequal and hierarchical worlds. The rise of the global right bespeaks a transnational anxiety about place. Rather than focusing on nativism, thinking in and out of empire reminds us that we are all adapted to the worlds that we no longer can call home because they do not exist. Increasingly with climate change, home might be thousands of miles away on another continent. Reckoning with the false borders and boundaries of nations and nationalisms are not just about human worlds, but also plants, the crops that feed us, the fabrics that clothe us, the lumber that houses us. We need new nature cultural imaginations that reckon with the botanical amnesia that consumes us. We cannot be ahistorical and ground our lives in an originary politics of purity, litmus tests of plant origins, landscape restorations to some mythic past, savior politics of pure seeds and pure germplasms. It is telling that we work desperately to conserve and save native germplasm seeds and plants with greater zeal than saving native people, native cultures, and native worlds. We cannot celebrate heirloom and native seeds without celebrating and sustaining the native botanists, the native cultures, the native lands that nurtured these seed worlds. At the same time, as refugees, we must also respect the histories of land, of violence and conquest. A decolonial botany must overthrow a reductionist botany that celebrates seeds without peoples or cultures and their histories. If race and nation emerge front and center in the case of botanical biogeography, sexuality emerges as a critical node in reproductive biology. The innovation of sexual reproduction is most often posited as an evolutionary adaptation for the production of variation, the selective terrain and playground for natural selection. Thinking nature culturally means understanding not only how human sexual biology is indebted to frameworks of the natural, but also how scientific knowledge was founded on the twinned binaries of sexual difference and racial difference. Growing up in India, the plant world was forever enchanted. plants, their roots, shoots, leaves, and flowers were woven into mythological and folk tales. Never immobile, unintelligent beings, plants were active agents in fantastical stories. Plants housed transmigrated souls of the divine, human, and sentient beings. As this audience knows well, we have so many stories of plants that are woven into our mythological stories. The sweet, fragrant jasmine emerging with the churning of the ocean of milk, the tamarind tree and its sour fruit always being home to myriad spirits, the sesame tree emerging when Lord Vishnu's sweat fell on earth. Plants are essential and ubiquitous as digestives, health aids, beauty remedies, games, and musical instruments. Once I entered school, a botanical education disenchanted the natural world. Latin names I had to learn by rote erased the luxurious and magical context of my childhood. They severed plants from the world I lived and knew. But we were assured that it was scientific, it was universal. Scientists across the world used the same terminology. This was poor comfort for a child who didn't imagine traveling the globe. Universality is important to those who can travel and have access to other lands and knowledge systems. During my botanical education, its universal terminology seemed sterile, abstract, absolute, and without context. A study in botany and its Latin nomenclature was a study in alienation from the natural world around me. It was well into my forays into feminist science and technology studies that I discovered that the sterile binomial system of nomenclature of botany had its own enchanted, florid, indeed pornographic history. Londa Schiebinger opens her nature's body with hermaphroditic plants castrated by unnatural mothers, trees and shrubs clothed in wedding gowns, flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride. Are these the memoirs of an 18th century Academy of Science, or tales from the boudoir? And our answer is both. As Schiebinger reveals, these are categories Carl Linnaeus used for a scientific classification that was both abstract and universal. Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality, and his scientization of botany coincided with an ardent sexualization of plants. Schiebinger argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus of botany. In his nomenclature, Linnaeus did not use stamen and pistils, but introduced andria and gynea, which are derived from Greek husband and wife. Thus, the classes of plants end in andria and orders in gynea, and note the class or male is ranked higher than order or female. Linnaeus saw plants having sex in the fullest sense of the term. He borrowed terms from romance, eroticism, and the sanctity of love, nuptials, and marriage into his repertoire for vocabulary for plants. Plant sexuality took place almost entirely within the exclusive bonds of marriage. His renowned Key to Sexual System is founded on the Nuptiae Plantarum, or the marriage of plants. Linnaeus also classified humans to fortify the precision of race by ordering the 5 races of the world into categorical structures. The colonial legacy of botany is immense and deep, a deeply nature cultural world. Colonial expansion permeated the globes. Western systems of nomenclature supplanted local knowledges. Colonial legacies have dismantled and erased a plethora of languages, meaning-making practices, and nomenclatures to usurp multiple cultures of knowing and replace it all with a universal scientific monoculture of knowledge. As Jamaica Kincaid evocatively notes, this naming of things is so crucial to possession, a spiritual padlock with the key thrown irretrievably away, that this is a murder and erasing. Mary Louise Pratt argues that Linnaean classification ushered in a larger planetary consciousness that shaped European colonialism and exported a natural order that was shaped by Christian morality under the guise of science. Enlightenment thinkers put Christian ideas about natural and unnatural sex on a scientific footing. Social reformers, in turn, invoked this scientific nature to reorder and reorganize gender, sexuality, and the family across colonial states. European sexual mores, binary sex and sexuality, continue to ground plant biology today. A quick look at plant reproductive biology easily demonstrates the impoverished framework of the universal household. I don't have to stress to this audience the breathtaking array of reproductive arrangements in plants. I began counting the terms and gave up, but here are some of the key terms. Plants are categorized by the sex of the organism, which to me is a very dubious and unstable category we can talk about if you would like. But such that it is, if a species has male and female plants, they exhibit dioecy or two houses. They are monoecious if they have only one plant. Among monoecious plants, if they have two different flowers, male and female, or we may have them both in one a flower or hermaphrodites. It is important to note that over 85% of plant species are hermaphroditic, yet sex and gender remain obsessively overdetermined categories. But hermaphroditic plants do not all act the same, so we need new terminology. For example, we have dichogamy, which attempts to accommodate organisms that exhibit protandry, where the pollen functions precedes, or protogyny, where the ovule function proceeds. The male part is called the stamen and is composed of filaments, anthers producing pollen. The female, a pistil with the style, stigma, and ovule. These terms endure from Linnaeus, who created them as a version of human sexuality. For Linnaeus, these were elaborate and literal analogies of conversions. Filaments of stamens were the vas deferens, anthers the testes, the pollen the seminal fluid. In the female, stigma was the vulva, style the vagina, pollen tube the fallopian tube, the pericarp the impregnated ovary, and seeds the eggs. But in plants, it is never so simple, or for that matter, humans. There is more variation than rules, more exceptions than rules in the splendid exuberance of plant reproductive biology. A brief ride. An androdioecious plant has only male flowers, a gynoecious plant, female flowers. Androdioecious have male flowers on some plants, bisexual ones on other. Gynodioecious have hermaphroditic flowers and female flowers on separate plants. Androgynomonoecious, andromonoecious, gynomonoecious, polygamodioecious, polygamomonoecious, subdioecious, subgynoecious, trimonoecious, trioecious. I will stop here, but you get the picture. The proliferation of terms is to accommodate a world of seemingly infinite and imaginative plant variation into the limited vocabulary of European sex lives. You cannot but ask, why can't we count past two? Why look through the eyes of European puritanical sexuality to see only heterosexual male-female plant worlds? In learning to unread the sexual and racial genealogies that we have inherited, new possibilities to reread sexuality emerges for plants and humans alike. It is time to add a wrinkle in our story of what gets lost in translation across the colonial and the colonized. I have largely presented science as a hegemonic force of the West that was imposed on hapless colonized natives. In part, I did this because colonial powers and science claimed hegemony. Science as Western science, and indigenous and local sciences as the province of storytelling and cultural history, not objective scientific knowledge. Post-colonial and indigenous historians of science disabuse us of any such simple story. In the case of India, that I explore in my book, Holy Science, while colonialism indeed shaped and was shaped by colonization, it was no simple linear story of conquest. Unlike linear diffusion models that imagined colonized nations as passive grounds for the imposition of a superior Western science and civilizational logics, India and indeed all colonized countries clashed and resisted. Science in India appears to have progressed not through some wholesale imposition by the West, but through negotiations and hybridization. Something more complicated happened. Historians of colonial science have by now amply demonstrated that we can no longer assert a unique Western genealogy for modern technosciences. Instead, technosciences were already global by the 19th century. Western science appropriated and incorporated knowledges from across the world into its repertoire of what is called Western science. In India, colonial science tucked the technosciences away from their Western roots and combined it with Indian forms of knowledge. What emerged was a hybrid or braided science. India's modernity with science at its core was thus at once both Indian and Western. Hybrid sciences emerged from complex global circulations. A fascinating case in point is the Hortus Malabaricus, a botanical treatise credited to the Dutch governor of the Malabar region, Hendrik van Ried. Written in Latin, it was compiled over 30 years from 1678 to 1693. Since then, historians have revealed that Van Ried used local collaborators such as the Yerevan physician Iti Achutan Vaidyar, as well as other local doctors, healers, naturalists, amateur and local botanists. Together, they produced a 12-volume set of the earliest comprehensive work on the flora of Asia and the tropics. Centuries later, no published book can surpass the importance of the Hortus. Its English translator, K.S. Manilal, wonderfully summarizes the language in the Hortus. The local names of plants were dictated to Van Ried in the spoken or Vaimori form of the local language Malayalam. That was then translated into the Portuguese language, writing the names in the spoken form of the names themselves, from which it was translated to the Dutch language, and then from Dutch to Latin, used in the printed text of the book. During this tortuous multi-stage transformation, the Malayalam names, which even otherwise do not easily yield to European tongue or ears, had undergone severe distortions that are reflected in their depiction in Roman script in the book. Alongside their illustrations, Malayalam names were written in Malayalam script, which is also a great help in understanding them better. However, they are the exact transliterations of the spoken form of Vaimori that was used in the 17th century, written in an old script. Since then, Malayalam script itself, as well as the language, have changed. To compound the confusion, it also appears that many of the names in Malayalam script were written, perhaps later in Amsterdam and Leiden, by persons who had no knowledge of the language or its script. A tangled tale indeed. The Hortus and its legacy reminds us of the complex circuits of colonial science, the erasure of local scientists, the obfuscation of local knowledges, and the singular claims of a hegemonic science as Western science. So much is lost in translation. These stories remind us that there is no site of purity in the world, no site exempt from the hauntings of colonial domination. Whether we are plant lovers or professional botanists, colonial histories haunt. Examining botany, loving plants means taking up and taking on the vocabulary and conceptual landscapes of botany as a global universalized knowledge system. We need to recognize that the vast infrastructure of agriculture, the botanical separation of seeds, germplasm, plants from the natural, from their binary counterparts of humans, genomes, peoples, and culture, is a reductionist legacy of colonial botany. We cannot save native plants while decimating native peoples and the planet. Seeds are kernels of nature cultural moments. We cannot save seeds without saving the context of their evolution. We cannot restore our world to some mythic past we have long destroyed. We cannot claim native seeds and native plants without recognizing the long history of appropriation and theft. But we can strive for peace, seek justice, and return stolen land. To decolonize botany, we must respect the original land we all stand on. We need to imagine beyond a world where people give thanks to the land. Instead, we need to imagine what Robin Kimmerer insists, more than ecological restoration, the restoration of the relationship between plants and people. We must dream and work towards a time when we don't only give thanks to the land, but act in ways that the land might give thanks to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Banu. That was just absolutely fantastic. I'm quite overwhelmed, I have to say, with what you had to say. Rennie, do you want to say something before I start? All right. So to start off, you've summarized so much that uh, we've been thinking about, sort of after I started the lab on my return in India, and started looking at plants. And specifically what you said, I'll start from the last part that you started, which is the nomenclatural issues and the history the names carry. And taxonomy being something which is universal, because almost all cultures have given names, but Linnaeus sort of changed the way the names were given. And the interesting thing of the taxonomic literature that we have for plants is that the generic epithets in most cases have more of a colonial legacy, while the specific epithets in most cases have the geographic sort of connections. And it takes a lot in botany. I mean, pretty much if you're a taxonomist, you can map the colonial history just by mapping the names, and it is quite complex. But what has always boggled me when as a student, and I hope other botany students and or taxonomy students also recognize this, that the idea of taking the generic name, which is a higher order name, into a colonial sort of a world, and giving the specific name to the local geographic world is in itself shows the colonial discord that we have. So I'll start off with what you to summarize what you've said and thoughts that I have on what you have presented today. Um, Starting with one of the very tough questions, that's how do you extract natural resources from the land? And what is ironic here is that it's a question that we can ask it in multiple orders. We can ask the colonials about it, but I think we as modern city dwellers can ask this still to ourselves when in comparison to the indigenous people where we go to collect plants actively. So I consider myself as much a colonial in that aspect. When I go out in the forest and collect, and if I don't integrate the local sort of knowledge, and also, and when I say local knowledge, not just as a photograph or as an acknowledgement, but for their scientific skills, which I think we are still very far from acknowledging and accepting. And so when so it was sort of very important, the extraction of natural resources, um, and then claiming what you said right in the beginning, is something that is very haunting, because that's what we still do at even as an Indian biologist or botanist in India. There's still a hierarchy at so many levels: caste, religion, economics, social structures. And so I think it's very important to understand that colonialism is a word where the hierarchy needs to be also understood, that it can be at various levels, that me as an sort of indigenous or an Indian can still continue to do that with someone who's more native to a region than I am. The idea that you presented as well of once sort of extracting resources from an indigenous land, and then presenting it to be the protector of the same sort of resource, is very complex. And for me, psychologically, it's a very, very complex world, and a world where I think all of us struggle a lot, because we all as scientists treasure the idea of treasuring, or herbarias and museums. And yet when you go to a museum, it's a very sort of it's a very sort of emotional journey for me. It has always been, because you look at those herbarias and you feel related to the ones that come from your country, and they don't exist in your country. The argument that I've heard from people who think that this was okay is that this is how they preserved the taxa. And I often wonder if the preservation of taxa was so important over the land from where they collected it. And this is something that I found very interesting the first time I went to the Kew Botanical Gardens with my parents. And my mother is a very good gardener. And it was very interesting because while most people seem to, sort of observe and enjoy the plants, she seemed to just walk past most of it. And she would be like, I know this, I know this, I know this, I know this. They just brought everything from India. And I think that she pretty much felt like she owned the Kew Botanical Gardens because, she thought 50-60% of the plants were in her garden, and she felt very she felt like she was robbed, of her garden. And that, and here they were making so much fuss about having to grow the same thing under a, glass house. And I cannot exaggerate how much I had prepared myself knowing her interest in plants. And I had built it up saying, there's this temperate glass house in the greenhouse, and plants are growing under this very specialized thing. It's temperature controlled, moisture controlled. And when I saw her reaction, my first thought was, you're not appreciative of how difficult this is. And it took me a few years to realize how I was wrong in my thought process at that time, and that what she was said kind of represented this what we're talking now, of robbing sort of natives of their understanding of plants, um, uh, uh, not using this local information that we may have about botanical knowledge, and how to raise them. So it's a very difficult uh, topic, I think, for most of us who appreciate, sort of going to herbaria and studying plants and systematics and doing phylogenies or doing molecular work, but at the same time have to struggle with, where is the boundary for rights and sharing of information when it comes to that. Your thought on the invasive species was again extremely. I think we can possibly have an entire semester of classes on that. is is what is an invasive plant? I completely agree with you, and I also feel that that is another term which I think we should reconsider severely in biology per se. Because it is interesting, as an ecologist, we often talk about how plants sort of invade, or plants may actually immigrate or emigrate, causing diversity in the environment. So as an ecological concept, we agree that emigration and immigration is a good thing. But the minute it comes to a social structure, and it does the same thing genetically, that you're still again causing diversity in the gene pools. Somehow, though, when it comes to our social structure, emigration and immigration is not a good thing. So as scientists, I often feel like this is another concept which is very difficult, where we are extremely hypocritical, that we're okay with studying our organisms, immigrating, emigrating, looking at population genetic structure, but we're not okay with when that Homo sapien is one of the species which is doing it. And so that sort of is, again, a very, very sort of tough question, and a concept that I feel that many of us have struggled. In tropical biology, I have to say many of us have more recently thought about this, that invasive ecology and biology of plants, or animals for that matter, needs to be studied and revisited, because what we have been taught is from a very Western sort of concept of what invasive biology is, or what invasive plants are. And oftentimes in tropical biological systems, which is the tropics being most of developing countries or third world countries, invasion is not seen the same way. So the concept of invasion itself seems to be very colonial. And therefore, the concept of invasive biology for me right now seems extremely colonial. So, but it's a large field. Again, like I said, it'll take semesters for us to figure this thing out. The last point I sort of want to just sort of reemphasize, which you already mentioned, was the idea of plant sex and sexualization and gender queries in plants. my sort of slight sort of difference in sort of thought process there was that maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I always thought that plant biologists were more open to the concept of sex and gender because pretty much anything and everything can happen in plants, which seems to be not so much of a case for anyone who studies animals. And again, you may correct me on this one. And this was again the concept that you mentioned of terminologies which were adopted, or rather like taken from the animal world, added to the plants, such as the stamen, the ovary, the ovules, the egg. There is no egg. There is no concept of egg, but we call the ovules as eggs. So all the terminologies have been taken from the animal world, fitted into the plants, and then that's how we visualize. So even sort of organs and structures are visualized, or because of this inability of ours to see plants as a different organism, which still sort of genetically does similar stuff. But I do think that the fact that, I mean, at least this is my experience from conferences and meeting people, is I often feel that botanists tend to have a more wider view and more sort of liberal view on gender and sex, just because, I mean, in most cases, we're dealing with organisms where there is no boundaries. And in this context, sort of, I will quote, in fact, one of the quotations that you quoted in your paper, the Moored Metamorphosis, which I really like, which is Sunita Namjoshi's sort of quote that you used in the beginning, which says, I want to go back to that lost forest where metaphors mix, rub shoulders with each other, and everything turns into everything else. And to me, that quote is very resilient of how I see plants, because oftentimes we struggle to find those boundaries. And as we do botanical studies in my lab, I think most of my students and people who've been through my lab will agree that oftentimes I catch myself not having great results because we are not able to set that boundaries. And I often wonder if all these beautiful patterns that are coming out are coming out from Western labs because the boundaries are set very easily for them. While for me, I'm unable to make that decision of making a boundary, whether it be a species boundary, an ecological boundary, or any boundary. And only first time we've had, when you published one of our recent paper, that we're finally starting to see reviewers who are respecting our lack of boundary, and they're able to see, and they see that we're resisting from drawing a boundary of species, not to question the concept of species, but that we want to sort of resist if there is no pattern, that we want to say there is no pattern, because there's a lot of intermixing of genes and intermixing of characters as in the plants that we study. And I feel like right now is a good time, like we discussed right in the beginning, to discuss these topics and try to see biology differently because of where we come from and how we study, therefore, our natural systems around us. So I do think that this gender boundaries or lack of boundaries, for that matter, is kind of unique to plants. Again, more people from animal who are in the audience can interject and correct me. And lastly, like I said, the naming, the taxonomy, where many words have been bastardized in some ways because of the colonial use. And what is interesting is that if you do nomenclature work and if you're describing new species, half the time we're sort of struggling trying to find the location, because the location name also has been written by British, but it was, the vernacular name is something else, and we can never trace it in the map because the pronunciation was different. And this makes science very difficult for us as local people to understand it. So for me as an Indian, to locate that location becomes very difficult. While interestingly, the same location is very well known to everyone in Kew or in Edinburgh or in any of this Royal Botanic Garden, because those names are well known to them. So it is sort of a very, what colonial science has done is that it has taken the science and the biology out of us, out of our lands, made it their own, And now we are sort of re-studying it from their perspective, and we are not able to actually put these two puzzles together because they actually don't match. And for decades, I think we have struggled to match them and not really say that should it even match in the first place. And so the struggle right now, I think, I hope for biology and sciences is that we should question if who's saying the narrative and what is that narrative, and if that narrative has a history, and we should judge sort of science from that narrative rather than question our own understanding of how the system is. So it's somehow I feel like we'll have to reinvent a lot of things in the coming decades if we want to get it right for our lands and for our science, both. So with this, I thank you again for this wonderful talk, and we can open it up for questions, or Banu, if you want to sort of reply to some of my comments.
I thought that was so wonderfully rich. Thank you. And I think you, and I think there was, one of the questions in the chat was saying, how do we go forward as plant biologists? And I think you laid out very well that it has to start with questioning the very terminology, the very theories by which we understand the world. So I thought you were that was really beautifully put. And so as an example, I'm thinking of something like invasive species. So clearly there's a lot of ecosystem damage, right? So it's not as though, I'm not suggesting we just open our boundaries and anything goes, right? It is about how do we understand what has happened and what needs to be happened within these particular colonial histories. So if we don't use the term invasive species, what terminology should we use? If we don't use male, female, sex, gender, what terminology should we use, right? And I think there's some, wonderful comments in the chat that also suggest that there are other histories out there, other, we always act as though only India had mythologies, and Aditi, who knows much more than I do, is talking about the Ovid and Virgil, and that Linnaeus has, draws from his own mythological backgrounds in the ways in which he has theorized plant history. And so it really comes down to us developing, as Vinita is suggesting, new vocabularies, new theories, and that I think at least my growing up and being trained in India, it was so much the Western scientists have said it all, we need to follow it, that is the big T truth, but really taking on agency to question it, right? And some of it we may agree with and some of it we might not. And how might those spaces where we don't agree with become grounds in which to propose other kinds of theories, other kinds of languages, other kinds of vocabularies. So I loved your comments because I think it really opened up what is before us, and it's so exciting what is before us, right?
Absolutely. Rennie, should we take some of the questions? There are quite a few questions in the chat. Do you want to read some of them?
Who wants to ask the question? That's also possible.
Oh yeah. If you want to ask, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Shantan, do you want to ask the question? You can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. There were other questions before me. Do you think?
Oh, sorry. Oh, hang on. Rennie, do you want to Rennie, do you want to go by the?
Has asked a question. So Harish, are you there? Would you like to ask the question? Unmute yourself and ask, Harish.
So I think someone in the chat itself has answered Harish's questions, that there have been many schemes and classifications before Linnaeus. And since Linnaeus, for example, as molecular techniques have emerged, so the theory of evolution really reshapes, sort of the ways in which we understand the relationship of plants and nomenclature.
So Harish is there. Harish, if you want to explain the question a bit, you can, because you're there. You have to unmute.
Fine. I think we are done. I think Banu's answered the question, so I think you can move on to the others. Thank you.
Okay, so there's Sahla Abdu, you had messaged me.
And can I
Friday,
just
you
say
said-
one more thing to Harish's, it's a great question, is that, so part of the way I'm thinking about it, on the one hand, we have anthropomorphism that we always warned against, but the opposite of that is human exceptionalism, that only humans do things that plants and animals don't do. And that also seems like a problem. So really the challenge is that space between anthropomorphism and human exceptionalism. And how do we recognize that we all have a shared evolutionary history, but at the same time, all species are not the same. So I think it's that challenge, that space that I feel we need to work with.
Can I just, if I just follow with that, in that, so we need some kind of a taxonomy. So where exactly are we going to get the taxonomy from?
So to me, again, it seems that there can be many taxonomies, right? Part of the problem becomes when we say, this is the only way one sees the world. So if we are thinking in terms of morphological adaptations and how things look, we would organize the world in one way. If we're purely going by molecular taxonomies, we would organize the world in a different ways. So bats, even though they fly, are mammals. Fish, whales, even though they're in the water, are mammals, right? So, and this is a rich debate in systematics and taxonomy of biologists who are wrestling with these questions of how do we organize the world and understand the world in the ways in which it makes sense. So it seems that we could keep alive these various kinds of relationships.
But if plants have souls, and can we then have economies based on the fact that they have souls and sentient beings? Is that possible?
I think within certain cultural understandings, yes. Within other cultural understandings, no. I feel part of what Western colonialism did is saying, this is the way we see the world. Plants don't have souls, and therefore that's not a legitimate place for botany. But if we understand the role of plants in different cultures as a nature cultural process, where certain peoples, see the possibility of souls in plants, see the possibility of transmigration of souls, across all kinds of species boundaries, that is a different cosmological view. So I don't see why one needs to be erased for others. So to me, part of the Western scientific process where everything became things and therefore colonizable is also a philosophy that has gotten us to this point in the world with respect to climate change, where humans have said, you can destroy anything, nothing matters, it is manifest destiny, it is our role to be able to do that. So it has its own problems. So here, I'm just, what I'm suggesting is that I don't see why there can be only one way to look at the world. And why we can't, not that these are all equal or in equal footing. They all bring different philosophical tools to us. And so I would suggest that, we go through a process where we open this world up and see where it takes us.
Okay, thank you.
And so there was, sorry, 1 second, right? There was one person who wrote the question, wanted to ask a question while Banu was talking. Sahla Abdu, are you still here?
Yes.
Sahla Abdu, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? Is Sahla Abdu here? Can you see the person in the chat? Okay, I don't see the name. So, all right, fine. We can then maybe go to the other person who raised hands. Rennie, are you able to see?
Aditi has a question, but it's been answered. But in case Aditi wants to speak up and maybe explain the question. Aditi,
oh yeah, I'm here. Right, yeah, no, you did. Thank you for the talk. You touched on what I was talking about anyway, but I guess I just like to add one thing, that rather than thinking of it as like a West-East distinction per se, I would think of it as, and I think that's something that I mentioned there as well, as like a kind of violence done by the what I'd call the Enlightenment project. Because, I mean, if you think about it, I was thinking of Ovid's Metamorphosis, from which so much is derived, which already has an idea. I mean, there's a metamorphosis from one plant to another, multiple sexualities and genders being played out. There's a lot of, there's metempsychosis, so transmigration of the soul is a very rich idea there. So I mean, to claim that it's simply a question of, I mean, yes, we have to sort of think of the violence done on the part of the colonial project, to indigenous cultures, but also to cultures that they claim as their own. And that's what I was thinking.
Absolutely,
that,
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
no, that was beautifully put, and I could not agree more. And, sometimes, you're right, that maybe it is more precise to locate this with, in terms of the Enlightenment. But I feel sometimes that kind of obfuscates transnational and global politics. So maybe you have to find some better way to integrate both of these. And this was a point I think Vinita was making, is that so much of the, the post-colonial elite have taken on the Enlightenment project, right? And so, the question of that the third world is not all indigenous.
Yeah, black skin, white mask, so yeah.
Absolutely. And I also really love the point Geeta Chadha is making in the chat about that we also should not practice a kind of proto-nativism where anything that comes from the indigenous or native is great. I mean, we may acknowledge it and recognize it, but we also need to be critical of that. And especially in the context of, contemporary Hindu nationalist politics, where all science was now in the Vedas, so we also, we need a critical genealogy and need to look at these things critically. Completely agree.
But just to interject one on what Geeta said and this idea of this Ayurveda, though, I often catch myself finding that the concept of Ayurveda itself is the way it was taught and the way it is in the text is different from the way we are reviewing it right now. So I think there itself there's a huge discrepancy, because we are not going to the indigenous and asking them how are you using the plant. We people from sort of the metros have decided how a plant is to be eaten, and I can assure you, if I give you a new ginger, 90% of these people will not eat it because it has not been tested. While a native will, if I introduced a new ginger species, gave the taxonomy, made them understand that how they're related, chances are higher that an indigenous person may actually try it or may actually already know about it. So I also feel like the way Ayurveda is being presented right now is as an accepted, sort of tested, or rather questioning the plant phytochemicals is not what we're truly asking. We're talking about just knowledge which is there. But if anyone asked for actually how the phytochemicals were working, which requires a lot of scientific study, we are not investing there. So I think the Ayurvedic ideas needs to be tested. We all agree, but there is a strong lethargy in actually doing it because it is difficult. So we are cutting corners to get to, repeating the rhetoric that we all like, So sorry, there are three hands. So shall we go? Shantan, did you raise first? Please go ahead.
So I just want to, this is great conversation and of course wonderful talk, Banu, and wonderful comments, Vinita. So I was actually thinking in terms of Ayurveda. I must say that I'm not an academician. I'm a journalist, and I look at history of science and intersections between science and society. And when we talk about colonialism and indigeneity, if I am to contextualize it in the Indian context, then what comes across very interesting to me is that Brahmins and Savarna people claim to be the indigenous people of India, right? These are the people who go to the US and say that they are indigenous people of India. Now, when it comes to Ayurveda, the birth of Ayurveda is inexorably linked to caste. And I just want to foreground this question of caste as we think about indigenous knowledge and even gender. So there are these trans-religious people called Shiva Shaktis in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra. These are transgender women who have been practicing some form of traditional medicine for millennia. And with the birth of Ayurveda, what has been observed is that people who would earlier go to these Shiva Shaktis for treatment have now moved to Ayurveda simply because Ayurveda has been shown, Ayurveda is practiced by Brahmins, Vaidyas are all Brahmins. And being Brahmin seems to bring some sort of legitimacy to that knowledge system. So, so basically what I would really like all of us to think about is how the question of indigeneity has to be complicated, especially in the context of caste and gender, and how Ayurveda itself was born by deleting and ostracizing and sort of stealing from pre-existing indigenous knowledge systems. So Irula tribes, Mala tribes, Santhal tribes who had already established knowledge systems have all been deleted and sort of subsumed under this banner of Ayurveda. So if anybody would like to comment on that, yeah.
And that Ayurvedic knowledge itself, appropriated knowledges from, right? So that there's a similar hierarchy within India. I completely agree. And I think there's, so much work needs to be done in tracing these relationships. And the other point that, in the chat about, and so one of the things in this work that I'm very careful to say is that the native of invasion biology is not the native of the indigenous, right? That native is a term that gets politically constructed. So in the US, it's the white settlers who are native, and as similar politics within India. So again, these categories, when we understand them not as natural categories, but political categories, then I think we recognize them as constructions. And as you were just saying, we need to understand the histories of these terminologies and how they came to be, because power and politics is always at the center of any knowledge project.
Yeah, I think, what I was also trying to say is the question of nature cultures, which you very interestingly brought up, Banu. I was thinking about the fact that these tribal populations, these trans-religious populations have existed in nature cultural relationships with the medicinal knowledge and the plants that they're working with. And then Ayurveda comes, and it looks to me that Ayurveda actually becomes this interventionist force that is supposed to extract medicinal property from plants and sort of disrupt the relationship between nature cultures. So I was wondering if, so yeah, that's more of a comment, but thank you. That's a very helpful response.
So in part of what you're locating Ayurveda within an Enlightenment philosophy.
I think so. I'm not.
Yes, and I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, and Ayurveda itself evolved, correct, as a practice.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. I think John has a question. John?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Subramaniam. I come to this with a certain level of conflict with my own background, both as a biologist and as a historian of science. And taken as I am, for example, with the work of people like Robin Wall Kimmerer with braiding sweetgrass, and again, a particular vantage point from which you're coming from, a particular sense of indigeneity within the Native American population, and what she's doing, again, as a botanist as well as a member of that particular community. I'm still concerned about the danger, potentially, or the peril of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And part of this comes, and let's place this Linnaean project, for example, in the 18th century. Look at the very thorny place where taxonomy itself is. We're thinking about people like Buffon, you're thinking about the Jussieu, and you're thinking about the 19th century Bentham and Hooker and all that they're doing. A taxonomy itself is up for grabs, right? William Jones himself comes out and famously excoriates the whole sexual aspect, which Linnaeus is doing. And yet it's interesting because one of the reasons that the strength of the Linnaean system lasts is because, of The pros and cons, perhaps, are reductiveness, right? The fact that you're coming to the binomial as opposed to the polynomial, you've got the sense you can call something what it is, what they say it is, reduced to two names, which then remain across the board. And this, in some sense, continues to last despite the fact that we have different ideas about what a cheese is, cheese concept, phylogenetic to the life. Despite the fact that we've had cladistics, despite the fact that you've had a number of concerns as to how you name something. And so I'm wondering whether within the epistemology of that, drawing major concerns and saying this, there is a great deal of colonialism imbricated in the project. How far is this taken before the system itself unravels? And what does this do to our understandings of taxonomy and our continuations of particular standards of reference upon which so much of the edifice of botany and zoology have been built?
Okay, you lost me in the middle. Your connection was...
Tell me where.
So you talked about, William Jones, the binomial system, and then in between you were talking about, I think, molecular phylogeny and cladistics.
No, all I was saying was that this has lasted through because it's been a useful system of reference. Now, as a historian of science, I can say, yes, we need to question this a great deal of from where these come, and I'm sure a number of people who study plants or watch birds will probably tear their hair out with frustration the way with lumping and splitting alone, how many names get changed in our lifetimes of the same species, right? But that is within that particular context anyway. Now, if we were to add this, what does this do eventually to the projects of botany and zoology, where we've stuck with a particular system of understanding for well nigh 2.5 centuries? What do we do? What does it do for the scientist on the ground who's working within these systems? And I'm just curious. I mean, and the analogy can be drawn immediately to, say, forms of medicine. Ayurveda has been drawn to a great deal, and Sorensen makes an eloquent case from where that comes. But why is it seen immediately as another way of looking at things versus the allopathy? And I'm just wondering what this does in the larger debate about taxonomy itself. Thank you.
So it seems like part of what, I mean, and I love your work. So, thank you for that question. And I hope we can be in conversation now that we have met, even though it's online. So the way I'm thinking about this is partly it is about that standardization project in the history of science. Mm-hmm. And part of how I'm thinking about it is the need for that kind of universal taxonomy was really to aid the project of colonialism, so they could know that the plant here is the same as the plant there, right? So the whole impetus to have a universal system was to make a more efficient colonial apparatus. It isn't entirely clear to me why we can't have multiple languages of taxonomy. Why, people in different localities who have words for local plants that describe the ways in which the plants are entangled in people's lives can't coexist elsewhere. And this is the same issue, everywhere, right? American children who have to learn Latin when they are engaged with plants around, in particular kinds of ways. So I think this whole taxonomical this universal system that forces this rote learning creates a kind of alienation with the natural world, which might in part explain this impoverished relationship that humans, especially urban humans, have with the plant worlds around. And so to me, it's not, I understand what you're saying, and botanists can continue to do what they want to do. And the botanists disagree with each other on which kind of, that each of these taxonomical projects allows, so cladistics allows a very different, different understandings that highlights a certain evolutionary architecture as the way to look at the plant world. And others disagree, that there are other kinds of relationships that can be highlighted. So to me, I feel the ways in which at least I was taught botany, you are taught it's a very progressive history. you know, these people first thought this, then this person improved on it, this person improved on it. So there's a way in which other ways of looking at the world become historical artifacts. But it's this lack of capacity to recognize that different taxonomical systems allow us to understand the natural world in different kinds of ways. And perhaps there is value in, you know, in a multiplicity of languages.
Okay, I don't want to keep this too long. Just keep. Thank you so much for your kind words, Subramaniam. I just want one thing though. This is the question about being able to speak across the board. And one of the things that science arrogates to itself is a language of universality. So if there were a multiplicity of languages, if you want to have standards of reference whereby we actually speak with each other, how is that effectuated? And this is not at all to belittle or demean what is being the actual strength of multiplicity of form. But if we're looking at standards of reference, we can question, but how do we go about it? And I'm in a way that, I mean, and from a point to say, what do we do about the bricks, do we say, in terms of architecture?
But my question is, why is the Enlightenment the standard?
Yeah, that's fine, but we can question that.
So, okay, so maybe we should move the standards around so that the you know, people following the Enlightenment project have to learn a different taxonomy, a different nomenclature. It just seems that in terms of power relations, it's a very unequal relationship. Some people always have to learn, you know, about the Enlightenment project. They have to give, you know, and there are so many kinds of rich understandings and theories and cosmologies in the world that we don't know about, that become parochial knowledges. And so part of what I'm wrestling with is, how do we decenter the Enlightenment project? Not that all these other knowledges are, you know, will yield always, but it seems that we don't even give that a chance.
Thank you so much. I mean, lovely meeting you, and lovely.
I hope we can stay in touch.
Thank you, Rennie.